Ah, I see you have come for another story. Well, it has been quite the year, hasn't it? Huh. I know. Why don't we talk about pressure? Pressure can forge diamonds, but it can also destroy mountains. Let me tell you the story of Ahmed Tailor, a young spaceship captain.
Time of event. In the darkness, one light came to life. The red glow, illuminating more than it should, blinked insistently. Ahmed reached over, barely registering the words "time of event" as he switched the warning off. He sat back, the bulky suit providing no comfort in the tight pilot's chair. Beyond the forward viewport, stars seemed both fixed and racing as he stared into the deep abyss of space.
Nice night for a walk, eh, boss?
Nikita said. Ahmed scoffed in response. Nothing like a bad joke to lighten the mood. He started to look toward her, but his eyes fell upon the crew photo taped to the console. The corners of his mouth tilted upward slightly, though looking at the 5 smiling people gave him a strange sense of sadness. There was Ahmed himself next to Nikita, trying to look professional while Andy made a silly face. Yo-Yo was in the back, giving just the barest hint that she knew the photo was being taken. A ghost of a smile. Connor, on the other hand, gave the camera the full salute. He still had time for a grin, though. Ahmed looked away, finally setting his eyes on Nikita. He imagined the faintest smile creeping onto her face. With a click, he disengaged the harness and stood up from the chair.
Come on, the joke wasn't that bad.
Nikita called after him as he headed toward the hatch. Nah, Ahmed responded. Just gotta go check on stuff. He risked one last look at the back of her chair. You got the helm? He could see the wave as she dismissed him. He left feeling better. The thin corridor leading to the rest of the ship was darker than usual, though they were running silent. The dark junction ahead filled the young captain with a quiet dread. The starboard corridor would take him to the crew's quarter and medical. The port would lead to the elevator for engineering and cargo. Straight, however, ended in a solid-looking blast door. Ahmed caught himself staring at it. Voices mumbled in his head, demands, shouting fear. He cleared his thoughts with a shake, then turned down the port corridor. Andy was slumped over his desk, looking very peaceful. There was an unfinished requisition form under his face. It was damp and slightly sticky as Ahmed pulled it away. He gave a sound of disgust as he dropped it onto the floor. There was a response, a groan, or a grumble. Andy was waking. "How's the nightlife treating you?" Andy asked with a laugh. Ahmed shrugged. "Well, what brings you down to my humble abode?" Andy had said that so much it was almost his catchphrase by now. He would always make a wide, sweeping gesture to show his office. Ahmed couldn't resist a laugh. The crew was a very close family, and he loved them. They made everything more bearable. Time of event. The errant words crossed his mind, barely a whisper. "Just checking, making sure you're getting your work done," Ahmed responded. "Ah, come on. I need to sleep sometime." Andy and Ahmed laughed at the old joke. "Yeah, go on, get to your bunk." "You got it, boss," Andy said with a smile. He was the youngest of the crew, but he meshed in so well. Ahmed saluted him as he turned back toward the elevator. Andy must have been tired to fall asleep on his desk like that. The elevator door slid shut behind Ahmed. He pushed the lowest button. Illuminated in the bright white light of the elevator, there was a flash of red, a smear. Blood? Across the button. Ahmed looked at his fingers closely. There was nothing on them. His eyes shot back to the button. It was clear. "I need sleep too," Ahmed laughed to himself. Engineering was always dark. Seemed a bit counterintuitive to work in such poor lighting, but Connor liked it that way. He claimed he made less mistakes when he couldn't see what he was doing. The engines were basically the entire deck, though he did have an office in the back. Ahmed worked his way toward it. "Connor!" he called. There was no response. The propulsion engines ran nearly silent. He definitely should have heard that. There was a quiet dread gripping his heart as the captain grew closer to the office. He couldn't explain what it was, but he knew Connor wouldn't be there. Before this mission, engineering was Connor's home, though now he spent more time with The thought derailed. The fear crept in. He would have to make his way back to the junction. The blast doors loomed ominously before the captain. There was no reason he should be afraid, but even just looking at them caused his palms to sweat. Sure, the mission was pretty important. His mind drifted. He steadied himself as he opened the seals on the door. There was a slight pressure change as the door loosened, and the air rushed into the umbilicus. Ahmed pushed the door open. The low light of the ship continued beyond it. He could barely make out the form of someone. His hand rested on the butt of his gun.
Hola, Captain.
The young woman's voice came from the darkness. Ahmed relaxed. Hey, Yo-Yo, what are you doing back there? He walked into the umbilicus, meeting her before she had to move.
Why are you so jumpy? Do I need to check you out? Limit your coffee intake?
Ahmed laughed. No, I'm fine, he assured her. She didn't move. The look in her eye almost mirrored his own fear. Big mission, what can I say? Got us all a bit jumpy.
I guess so, but take it easy on that coffee, okay?
He gave her a nod, pushed on down the umbilicus. Connor back there? He asked over his shoulder.
Yeah, I was with him when it happened.
Ahmed stopped, cold running through his veins. He turned back to her. When what? He asked. The look of fear was still on her face.
When? What? I just said I was with him.
Ahmed shook his head. You may be right, Yo-Yo. I'll stop by medical when I'm done here. He turned back and continued his walk down the umbilicus. The white light flooded in through the hatch, almost blindingly bright. Ahmed had to squint and stop for a moment. Every time he entered the room, he was awed by the sheer spectacle of it. He felt like an alien, unwanted and unclean as he set his boot down on the white catwalk. The small console shone a light blue as he walked past. The sheer length of the room was dizzying to ponder. There was Connor, sitting against the rails with a datapad in one hand and a spanner in the other. Ahmed refused to let his eyes drift any higher from the floor. He focused on Connor and walked purposely forward. Can't even bring yourself to look at him. The voice was sudden and caused him to stop. He took another step, raising his head in defiance, letting his eyes rest on the massive blue cylinders around the catwalk. He imagined he could make out each individual face beyond the cold exterior, as impossible as that was. Feckin' disturbing, eh, Cap? Connor's voice broke through the nerves. I didn't even want to come down here. Ahmed laughed. Hard to believe this is it, huh? Connor continued. Hard to believe I'm in charge of this, Ahmed said. The large cylinders hovered ominously above him. Now he found it almost impossible to look away. All accounted for? He asked. It was a pointless question. Not like they could just up and walk away. Yep, all 3 billion of them, Connor answered, no hint of awe in his voice. Biggest and arguably the most precious cargo they had ever had. Yet Connor was acting like it was a shipment of wine. Ahmed looked down at the engineer. Connor had a pained look on his face. How do you keep so calm? It's easier when you don't think of him as human. Ahmed cocked an eyebrow at him. How could you not? It was impossible for Ahmed to forget that all hope for humanity floated just behind his ship. His eyes wandered around the cryopod, so many miles of frozen humanity. He couldn't help but shudder. We're not going to make it, Connor said. What? Ahmed dropped his gaze to him again. You're not going to make it without sleep. Ahmed shook his head. You're right. He turned and left Connor where he sat. What are you still doing here? Ahmed asked. Yo-Yo looked at him. The same expression as before, maybe a little softer.
Just waiting for Connor.
He walked past her through the umbilicus. His only real thought at the moment was his bunk. Don't you two stay up too late. He waved as he stepped back onto the ship. The dull thunk of the blast door closing had an eerie sense of finality to it. Everything was too bright, just a little out of focus. He knew it didn't look like that. He knew it had been normal. Captain Tailor. Ahmed's vision swam as he focused on the person in front of him. Sometimes it was that soldier, the one with their orders. Other times, the face became Connor's. Regardless, there was an anger, fear, so much of it spelled out in their faces. We're not going to make it. The words were hauntingly familiar. You need to get them out of here. No, that's not what he said. You need to get rid of them. Wait. Captain Tailor, we are dying. The words echoed as Ahmed jolted awake. It took him a moment before he realized he was in his own bunk, though he could almost feel the heat of earth against his skin. He lowered his legs off the side of his bunk and sat up. The sweat beaded off his forehead, dripping onto his bare legs. He took a deep breath to steady himself. The crew needed him to keep it together. As Ahmed stood to dress, he noticed the rest of the crew had already woken and were gone. Good. They should keep themselves busy. He left the berthing for the mess hall. The silent walk down the corridor was intimidating, oppressive. No happy sounds of laughter, no jovial cursing. As Ahmed opened the door to the mess, he expected to see his crew having the first meal of the day. No. The room was empty, cold. It was as though they hadn't eaten here in a while. The captain took a mug and poured a cup of coffee, not even questioning how long it had been since somebody made a fresh pot. Then he sat at the table alone. He sighed deeply. Just as he lifted his mug to his mouth, he heard the door slide open with a familiar hiss, and Andy walked in. Ahmed had to smile. "Breakfast for one, garçon?" he shouted. "It's too early," Ahmed groaned back. Andy laughed and grabbed a mug. He paused by the coffee, looking puzzled. "This still good?" he asked. Ahmed looked into his mug. The black abyss of coffee had a strange, oily film floating on it. He shrugged and took a swig, wincing at the taste. But otherwise, it seemed fine. "If I die, you know it's bad," he laughed. The sound of Andy's laugh was wonderful in the silence of the ship. YOLO, isn't that what you old people say?" "Hey, that's well before my time, kid." "Well, feck it anyway." Connor's voice was deeper and his lilt almost musical. He shouldered Andy aside to take a mug of coffee for himself. They both joined Ahmed at the table. "Ta boys' time." Connor lifted his mug in a salute. "And shite coffee." They talked, mostly about nothing. It was a welcome break from the pressure. But the real world caught up with them again, and Connor bowed out to get to his maintenance. Andy left too, going to help where he could. Ahmed sat alone again, staring at their mostly untouched mugs of cold coffee. He should probably get to work as well. He poured the coffee out and put the mugs in the cleaner. Then he headed toward the door. Ahmed froze in place. The steel of the door gave a blurry reflection of the room. He could see his own silhouette, but behind him, there was no way to define what was being reflected. Almost in one move, Ahmed grabbed his sidearm from his hip and turned, the barrel pointing solidly at nothing. His breath hitched as he released it.
Something wrong, Captain?
Ahmed turned back to the door. Nikita stood there. Her eyes kept drifting nervously to his gun.
What are you doing with that?
The words echoed in his mind as she spoke. Nothing. He laughed uneasily, then holstered his firearm again. "I just thought I saw..."
So what?
She looked behind him. He shook his head. "Nothing," he repeated. His breath came easier. Nikita nodded slowly. "I'm headed for the bridge. See you there?" He forced a smile.
Sure, don't want you seeing all of space without me.
The corridor echoed with his footsteps as Ahmed reached the junction. His head turned almost automatically toward the blast doors and the umbilicus beyond. There was a faint whispering in his ear. He could hear something. A fight? Maybe an argument? Dread welled up inside him again. As suddenly as the whispering started, it ceased. A single word echoed in his mind. Guilty. The hatch opened and Ahmed stepped onto the bridge. He stopped for a moment as he saw Nikita wave at him. He turned back to the door, then back to her. "I thought you were in the mess hall." It was more of a question. She shrugged.
I was. Now I'm here.
She looked like she was studying the panels.
You were acting weird in the corridor. Figured I'd leave you to it.
Yeah. He crossed to a seat and sat down heavily.
It's tough having the weight of the whole human race on your shoulders,
she said simply. He scoffed in response and switched off the red blinking light.
I'm serious. You should find a way to relax.
"Hi, serious.
Shut it.
He laughed, almost despite himself. The laugh drifted away into a tense silence. "I'm fine. I'm holding it together." He breathed a sigh. He leaned back into his chair again.
Go on. Make yourself useful.
Nikita insisted. Ahmed looked at her and blanched. He tried to keep his face from showing the reaction, no sense in worrying her about it. He blinked and the world went back to normal. "And do what?" he asked.
Anything, just to get you out of here. You're distracting me.
She laughed a little. He smirked. "I can tell when I'm not wanted." He stood up again. "I'll go see if Connor needs me." He walked to the hatch, then turned back once more. You okay? He saw her wave again. Her face was seared into his mind, the look of absolute terror, the blood. How could he have imagined her like that? The normal hum of the engineering decks was expected. What wasn't was the loud Irish swearing, though on this ship it should have been. Ahmed heard mumbling punctuated by a loud swear as Connor chastised Andy about something. He sighed and stepped up to the two of them. Captain, tell this gobshite to stop fucking things up with his grubby dog paws, Connor shouted. You heard him, Andy, Ahmed said. Yeah, but I still have no clue what he said. He talks like his mouth full of cotton, Andy replied. Now, children, calm down. Fuck off, you soiled end of a 2-horse cow, Ahmed laughed. That was a new one. Andy joined in. You're both a couple of guffawed baboons. Go on, Andy, I'll take over for you. Finally, someone who knows what they're doing, Connor agreed. Love you too, Connor, Andy said, wasting no time in getting out of there. Connor watched him go. As soon as he was sure the elevator was going up, he turned to confide to Ahmed. Bright kid. He'll be able to replace us all soon. Ahmed smirked. Well, until then, at least the two of us know what to do here. Connor and Ahmed set about the usual maintenance. Nikita was right. Keeping his head busy was exactly what he needed. It was good that he had started out as an engineer before he was finally able to afford his own ship. That way Connor wouldn't have to yell at him the whole time. This was going to be a long trip. These little distractions were going to be good for him. Got him. The voice was faint at first, echoing. Ahmed didn't react. His eyes were fixed across the deck, staring into the dark. There's something there, just beyond his ability to see. Captain! The voice came through clearer. Eyes. Were they eyes? Whatever they were, they burned red, boring into his mind. Ahmed! Too late. The searing pain snapped him out of his delusion. Ahmed pulled his hand back from the blue light of the engine plasma. He stared in disbelief at the charred skin on the back of his hand. What happened? He almost screamed. I don't know, Cap. You just had your hand in the lightning, Connor responded. Ahmed looked between his hand and the engineer, then into the shadows beyond. The eyes were gone now, but the pain in his hand was very real. Go and see my missus. She'll fix that for you. Ahmed could only nod as he turned to leave. You are reckless. Connor's voice came through his mind. He didn't stop to argue, just boarded the elevator, leaving Connor alone. The pain had gone, but not in a good way. The hand was swelling and bleeding, felt very warm, almost pulsing under his grasp. Ahmed stumbled into medbay. Yo-Yo was there. She looked at his hand and gasped.
What did you do?
She demanded. He sat on the bed before slumping over onto it. I put my hand into the plasma, he groaned.
What the hell did you do that for?
The look he gave her was stern. She put her hands up in defeat and went to the cabinet. Then she froze. What? What's wrong? Ahmed asked.
I don't know what to do.
Ahmed stared incredulously at her. What? She didn't respond, didn't even turn around. Just give me that alcohol and the painkillers. And bandages. He groaned as a wave of nausea flowed through him. She moved automatically, grabbing the alcohol and the bandages. She hesitated on the painkillers, but it was barely perceptible. She pulled a bottle and the injector down from the shelf. Yo-Yo dropped the medical things onto the bed next to Ahmed. Quickly but clumsily, she slid the bottle into the auto-injector, touched a few buttons, and slammed the bore against his arm. Sudden release of medicine into it was startling, but he held himself as still as possible. Yo-Yo poured the alcohol unceremoniously over his hand, then wrapped it clumsily in the bandage. As the medicine took effect, Ahmed could feel his own clarity returning. What is wrong with you, Yolanda? He asked, genuine concern in his voice.
I've never done this before,
she admitted. He stared dumbfounded. What? He asked. Didn't they teach you how to treat burns?
Of course, I just panicked.
She had to look beyond panic.
Just lay down and get some rest, and...
Ahmed laid back, lifting his legs onto the bed. As he drifted out of consciousness, he barely heard her finish.
Please, just let me live.
The sun raged, heaving in the sky. Even from Earth, the fluctuations were visible. Some just stood watching as their death grew closer. Others moved frantically, trying to find some way they could escape the inevitable. Ahmed stared through the thick glass, watching and waiting. He wasn't even sure why he was still here. The crew had a ship ready and he could bail now. Just leave Earth behind for good. Sure, the armed guards at his door were a deterrent, but not much. He glanced over his shoulder at them, then sighed and returned his gaze to the world below him. Half the world was dead already. The rest were going mad. There was no choice but to save as many as they could. To Ahmed, that meant his crew aboard the Dark. That was where he was headed before the soldiers grabbed him. He would hear them out first. Finally, the door opened behind him. He turned to face the newcomer. Another soldier, though the insignia on his collar said he was a superior. Not that Ahmed was familiar with military ranks, but it was much shinier than the two guards at the door. "Captain Tailor." The soldier looked at the file in his hand. "You have me at a disadvantage, sir," Ahmed replied, trying to sound snarky, though not sure if it came across well. The soldier extended his hand. Ahmed took it and shook. "I'm Admiral DeCant," he said sternly, "and your planet needs you." Ahmed cocked an eyebrow. "Bit dramatic," Ahmed responded. The Admiral handed the folder over to him. "We are dying," Connor's voice echoed from the soldier's words. Ahmed looked at the folder in front of him. It was kind of quaint seeing things written on paper again, though the implications were not welcomed. They were plans, some large vessel? Ahmed tried to make heads or tails of it, but couldn't. There seemed to be a distinct lack of a number of things that would make it a viable craft. "Are you trying to get me to fly something?" Ahmed looked up at the soldier. The world seemed blurrier now. "You need to get him out of here." Connor looked sternly at Ahmed. "How can you ask me to do that?" Ahmed responded. "It's just as normal as a regular delivery, but the cargo is more precious," the Admiral replied. This isn't right. The inflection seemed off in his words. Was he making a moral stand? Or questioning the reality around him? Ahmed shook his head. "We sent a team ahead of you, but most of our fleet is destroyed or incapable of this order." The soldier carried on as though Ahmed hadn't spoken. He hadn't. He had just stared dumb at the soldier, listening to the orders. The Admiral made sure he understood that the mission would go on with or without him. There was no way Ahmed would have refused, though. No, looking back, maybe he should have.
Captain Tailor, we are dying."
Connor's voice mixed with the Admiral's again. "I will not be responsible for their deaths!" Ahmed screamed and threw himself at the soldier. As Ahmed gripped his throat, the soldier's face shifted, becoming Connor, then back again. He felt the hard blow against his head. He hadn't seen the wrench. Ahmed's eyes snapped open. The med bay was empty. He stood, leaving his equilibrium behind him on the bed. He fell forward, landing on the desk. The medical terminal blinked to life.
"You need an antibiotic,"
Yo-Yo's voice whispered to him. Ahmed looked around for her. She wasn't there. No, that had been from another time, another place. His vision blurred as the world swam around him.
The cloaked beast stood waiting, the red eyes burning, aching for his soul.
Ahmed turned back to the terminal. He typed as steadily as he could, the words blurred before him.
The rancid breath seeped around him, making his neck slick and moist. The labored breathing caused Ahmed's blood to run cold.
A flash, and the computer brought up a number of green words on the screen. He recognized one, and stood, staggering towards the medical cabinet.
The heavy footsteps, the swish of a ratty cloak over the steel.
Ahmed grabbed the handle, throwing the door open. He slammed his hand among the bottles.
The hand reached out, slowly, getting closer.
He grabbed the bottle, one of the auto-injectors, and fumbled to get the bottle into it.
The grip on his shoulder was vice-like, painful, but Ahmed resisted.
He slammed the injector against his arm and felt the punch as the medicine was pushed into his body. He collapsed in a heap, vulnerable to whatever sought him. A dull throbbing echoed through his mind. Ahmed groaned. It was reminiscent of a bad hangover. He lifted his hand to his forehead and winced at the pain. Suddenly he remembered. His eyes shot open and he sat up, frantically searching the darkest corners of the room. He was alone. Another pulse. Ahmed groaned, doubling over. A wave of nausea threatened to overtake him, but he fought it, struggling to his feet. Ahmed made his way toward the door. It hissed as it opened. Nikita stared, fear in her eyes, as he passed her in the corridor.
"What are you doing with that?"
Her voice echoed behind him. His hands were empty, but he felt a strange weight in them. A stronger pain blossomed, forcing Ahmed to collapse against the wall.
"We are dying.
Ahmed winced, Connor's voice cutting through the maelstrom.
And he looked up as the door opened. The smile faded. The sudden impact of the wrench knocked Ahmed over. The captain collapsed to the floor of the corridor, gasping. Unable to hold back, he loosed the contents of his stomach onto the deck. The klaxons wound up, blaring through the ship. The red warning light blinked incessantly. Time of event flashed on the screen momentarily, before Ahmed switched it off again.
This is your fault.
Yo-Yo's voice sounded in his mind. Ahmed grabbed the wall, pulling himself to his feet. There was something wrong. He looked back toward the medical bay to Nikita. Garbled voices overlapped. The tone was accusatory, angry, scared. Ahmed stumbled down the hall. The crossroads were mere feet away. It may as well have been miles for how Ahmed felt. It's also them come. Connor's voice cut through again. Ahmed drew his sidearm, pointing it at nothing. He fought against the urge to fire, but it was powerful. Stumbling, he finally reached the blast door. The usual fear was there, but something else, some nagging emotion Ahmed couldn't name. The swish of the cloak over cold steel followed him. Ahmed pushed the first seal, then the second. After the sixth, the door thumped as the pressure equalized. He pulled the door open, letting light spill into the umbilicus. Yo-Yo stared, terror in her eyes, tears running over her face.
Please. Just let me live.
His blood ran cold. Tears welled up behind his eyes. The gun weighed heavy. He had to keep moving. He could feel the heat from its breath behind him, practically smell the rancid death in its mouth. He couldn't even stop to tell her how sorry he was. Then the final door opened and he stepped onto the bridge. It was a routine trip, a maneuver Ahmed had made dozens of times before. Hell, there was even a chapter in the piloting textbook about it. The math should have worked. But as he sat next to Nikita, watching her input the trajectory, something tickled at the back of his mind. Something he was forgetting. She smiled reassuringly at him. Then the ship rocked forward, leaving the orbit of the Earth and closing the distance to the sun quickly. He could practically feel when the gravity shifted. All good pilots could. He watched Nikita pull the ship starboard, hitting the surf of the sun. Then the gravity shifted again. A violent storm erupted from the sun. The klaxon sounded immediately. The usual soft white lights turned to an ominous red. The ship twisted. Another alarm sounded, warning of the pressure imbalance in the umbilicus as the cryopod waved freely. The bend was so bad Ahmed could see the tail of the cryopod on the port side of the viewport. Another pulse from the sun in the dark was sent spinning end over end. Nikita fought with the controls, trying to fire the stabilizers. There was a sudden jerk as the port side thrusters fired. More lights flashed on the console. Ahmed pushed the intercom. "Connor, where are my starboards?" he called.
"I'm working on it, Captain."
Connor's tinny voice replied. "Andy?" Ahmed responded.
"Already en route to him, sir."
Andy replied.
You'd better get down there too.
Nikita said. Ahmed stared at her. He could see it in her eyes. He put a hand on her shoulder. "This wasn't you." She nodded solemnly in response, then jerked her head toward the door.
Go. They need you.
He stood barely maintaining his balance as the internal gravity fought against the inertia of the spinning ship. Ahmed burst into the corridor, walking like a sailor touching solid ground for the first time in months. He staggered, reaching the crossroads, and turned immediately towards engineering. A sharp crack sounded from beyond the blast door. Ahmed stopped, staring in fear at the door and the umbilicus beyond. He fell toward the door and fought to open the seals. A screen lit up next to the door, warning of a pressure imbalance. His blood ran cold. Suddenly, the starboard stabilizers fired. The ship lurched as Nikita fought for control. Ahmed sighed with relief. However, the celebration was too soon. Connor's voice sounded over the radio again.
"Cap, we have a problem."
Connor said. "Tell me something I don't know," Ahmed replied.
"The thrusters on the pod aren't firing."
"Oh, shit. Nikita, stop the correction," Ahmed screamed.
On it. Matching spin now.
Ahmed could feel a shift in speed as the ship righted itself, then started to spin again. "We need to get out there and fix it now," Ahmed said.
"Aye, sir, suiting up."
It must have only been minutes, but it felt too long. Connor, Ahmed, and Andy were exiting the ship. The danger came in leaving during a spin, but they couldn't risk slowing down. They grabbed the side of the ship and eased along. "Whatever you do, don't look away from the ship. Keep your eyes on something solid."
"You don't have to tell me twice,"
Connor responded. Andy just groaned. He probably already looked. The cosmos spun around them as they sidled along the outside of the ship. They reached the umbilicus, and Ahmed's heart sunk. There was a noticeable torque in the metal between the ship and the pod. Several cables had broken free, sparking madly in the void. As the ship matched the pod's speed, the twist in the umbilicus became less strained, then flexed back. Connor and Ahmed set to work, patching and repairing what they could find. "Try!" Ahmed called.
Roger.
Nikita's voice came through his helmet. A spark, then a blue bolt, as the pod's thrusters fired. Ahmed let out a strained laugh. Connor slapped his back. "We did it. We're safe now." Ahmed stared out into space, watching as the blur of the cosmos slowed to a stop around them. His heart leapt, and the elation was practically intoxicating. The three men headed back into the ship. The 5 crew members stood on the catwalk. The lights flickered to life around them, flooding the pod with white. Connor was looking at his datapad. Yo-Yo stood just behind him. Andy stood with Nikita closest to the umbilicus, and Ahmed stood between them.
You were reckless,
Connor said, barely risking a glance up. "It should have been fine," Ahmed replied.
"Sure, it woulda, had the sun not been ready to explode."
Connor lifted his accusatory glance to Ahmed.
We're not meant to burn the thrusters that long,
Nikita said. Ahmed turned to look at her. Anger boiled in his mind. He didn't hold her responsible. It was his math, his orders, but...
"You need to get rid of him,"
Connor said matter-of-factly. Ahmed turned his ire on him. "What are you suggesting?"
"You know very well what I mean,"
Connor answered. Nikita threw her arms up.
I will have no part of this conversation.
She turned and left the pod, Andy following behind her.
"Look, Captain, we burned up a lot of fuel trying to stabilize the ship."
"We can't just abandon them," Ahmed said.
"There's no point anymore. The mission is a failure if we can't even make it back to the colony."
Connor's voice rose. Yo-Yo nodded behind him. Ahmed's anger was boiling his brain.
"I said no. We aren't. Captain Tailor, we are dying. It's us or them."
There was something akin to an audible snap in him.
Ahmed charged and launched himself at Connor. The Irishman's eyes widened as the captain tackled him to the ground. He fought against Ahmed's tightening grip. His breath was getting harder and harder as he fought. Ahmed tightened his hands around Connor's throat, barely even registering Yo-Yo's pleas for him to stop. He barely noticed the wrench until it slammed into the side of his head. Connor, now free, backed up, gagging until he reached the railing. He was still holding the spanner in the datapad. He watched in horror as the captain, blank in expression, rose to his feet. "We're not going to make it,"
Connor gasped out. Ahmed turned his face, pulling his sidearm. "As long as they do." Without hesitation, he raised the gun and fired. Connor's pained expression would remain. Yo-Yo screamed and turned, running for the umbilicus. The captain turned and fired again. Shot hit her leg as she stumbled into the darkness. The captain followed. He could hear her sobs, but they made no sense in his mind. She struggled, pulling herself up on the cables of the umbilicus. She turned to face him as he approached. The tears streamed down her face.
Please,
she begged.
just let me live.
He fired without response. She slumped against the wall. Andy looked up as the door to his office opened. The smile faded as he saw the gun and the blank expression on the captain's face. He stared in silence as the gun fired and he slumped onto the desk before him. He must have been pretty tired to fall asleep at his desk like that. Nikita turned in her seat, the look of fear on her face.
What are you doing with that?
A slight twitch. Ahmed's eyebrows sagged. Then the expression was gone. He fired true, hitting the pilot in her forehead. She collapsed into her seat. It spun to face her toward the viewport. Finally, the captain holstered his sidearm. He dropped heavily into his chair. In the darkness, one light came to life. The red glow, illuminating more than it should, blinked insistently. Ahmed reached over, barely registering the words "time of event" as he switched the warning off. He sat back, the bulky suit providing no comfort in the tight pilot's chair. Beyond the forward viewport, stars seemed both fixed and racing as he stared into the deep abyss of space. He was alone. The ship silently burned through space, leaving behind it a dead planet and a dying star. He bore no guilt for his actions. May that demon be damned. There were still many weeks of travel before he would reach the outpost. He would make sure that the last of humanity would reach it. The ship broke through the atmosphere, braking thrusters firing intermittently.
The ground crew crowded over the pad as the ship lowered its payload safely into the silo. The machines took over, large arms grasping and securing both ship and cargo. A hiss, and the exterior door opened. No light shone from beyond. The flashlight beams cut through the pure darkness. All was silent. 3 men moved slowly to the bridge. When the door refused to open, they forced it. "We have a body, sir," a tinny voice said in the darkness. Beams fell on the desiccated corpse, barely recognizable as human, that sat in the pilot's chair. "Name tag says Nikita." "Roger. Any sign of the captain?" "Negative." The sergeant's eyes lingered on the ominous hole in the pilot's forehead. Just a moment to spare. Then the team left the bridge. The blast door shifted open easily. There were signs of structural damage around the umbilicus. Some repairs were visible from this side, though it was clearly exterior work. "We have another one, sir." The beams cut through the darkness, landing on the corpse tangled in the cables. It would have been so easy to miss. "Yolanda," one of them read out. The sergeant wasn't sure who. He just stared at the dead, hollow skull. "Do we have power to the ship yet?"
"Almost, sir. They were so drained, I'm surprised they could land. Give my praise to the pilot."
The 3 men looked at each other in silence. "Will do," the sergeant replied. He pulled his rifle ahead of him, aiming it at the final door. One of the other men pulled it open. The room was dark. A barely visible red glow was the only light source. The men moved in. Only the sergeant had his gun out, aimed at the shaking light. There was a half-insane mumbling coming from it. The flashlights cut through the darkness. "Captain Tailor!" the sergeant called out. The corpse turned in response. Those eyes, the sunken face. It was alive, though barely. "Did you see it?" he asked no one in particular. "Captain Tailor, I'm Sergeant Hanson. Do you remember me, sir?" He closed the distance, keeping his rifle ready. There was a brief flash of recognition in the captain's hollow eyes. It passed. Did you see it?" he asked again. The sergeant lowered his gun, knelt next to the captain. "See what, sir?" The captain handed his datapad over to the sergeant. He took it and saw the words "time of event" flashing incessantly. Ahmed felt jubilant. At least he thought he did. He was sure he did. That was what the feeling was. He was absolved. No more guilt. The mission was complete. He tried to stand up, but his body refused to move. The 3 men, soldiers, stood talking to each other. They were looking at his datapad. They would know what he did. They would recognize his sacrifice. His arm moved almost on its own. The picture was clutched tightly in his hand. The smiling faces were invisible in the dark, but Ahmed had memorized them. He found the last reserves of his strength and staggered to his feet. The whole time? The one who had spoken before. He looked at Ahmed. A whisper. Cloth over steel. A familiar sound locked deep in his mind. "I did it. Mission accomplished." He saluted as best he could manage. There was a hum of power within the ship. Lights began to flicker below the catwalk. The sergeant stared, a look of fear? Something. "Captain Tailor," he said, taking the datapad from the other 2. A swish. Heavy footsteps. A deep, wheezing breath. "You encountered a solar storm while trying to leave the origin system? You tried to use a solar slingshot maneuver." Ahmed saw Yo-Yo step onto the catwalk, the look of pain on her face.
"This is your fault,"
her voice whispered in his mind. "And your ship was crippled." The breath blew hot on his neck. Nikita joined Yo-Yo, then Andy, finally Connor.
You can't even bring yourself to look at them.
"You were never able to restore power to the cryopod." Ahmed's brow dropped. His heart sank.
The hand gripped his shoulder tightly, burning his flesh.
"Everyone is dead," the power flickered on, lighting the room, as Ahmed stared in horror at the millions of lifeless bodies in the tanks. One word echoed in his mind.
Guilty.
And there you have it. It's quite interesting, isn't it? To think What would you do if you had the weight of the world on your shoulders? If you had all of humanity resting in your hand? We never know until we try. But anyway, that's going to be it for me for this year. Thank you all so much for joining me for this story. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully you will have a great evening and a very happy Halloween.